Excellent. Thanks for inviting CVC to come out today to the NEM 2019. As you mentioned, my name is Shannon Malloy. I've been with CVC for about 6 years now. So in the first 4 years of my time at CVC, I was involved a lot with the low impact development monitoring team and looking at the performance of these technologies. And in the last year and a half, I've been focusing more on implementation projects and trying to find a way to move beyond that lot by lot level uptake of low impact developments to find more of a communal approach to getting low impact developments into the ground. So that's going to be the key focus of my talk, is how we can navigate the resources that currently exist in Ontario to get LID in the ground more at that communal scale. So you've heard the term being thrown around the room a little bit, the STEP program today. So that's the Sustainable Technologies Evaluation Program. And it's split into two sectors. There's the energy side of it and also the water side. And the water side is a partnership between 3 conservation authorities. So Credit Valley Conservation, Lake Simcoe and Region Conservation Authority, as well as Toronto and Region Conservation Authority. So the bulleted list on this slide is kind of the key points of the water side of the STEP program. So LID is the first one. So that's kind of showing how the topic of this conference fits into the overall Sustainable Technologies Evaluation Program. And this presentation is really going to focus on that first bullet point for LID. So just an outline of a couple of the key speaking points of my presentation. First, looking at the current state of stormwater management through the focus on the Credit River Watershed. From there, exploring how we can use this piece of provincial legislation called the Drainage Act to help facilitate getting these communal, larger scale, multi-property, low impact development projects in the ground. And then finally present a study that CVC is leading that's actually looking at the technical and the financial feasibility of these communal stormwater management systems. So to kick it off, to get our bearings, this is the footprint of the Credit River Watershed. So the headwaters of our watershed and the upstream areas is on the north end of the watershed in Orangeville. And then the Credit River, it discharges in Mississauga directly into Lake Ontario. Building on top of the footprint a little bit, this slide is breaking down the land use in the Credit River watershed. It's about a 30-30-30 split between urban, natural, and agricultural. So when I first started at CVC, I was actually surprised to look at this land use breakdown. I thought it was a much higher percentage urban. But since there is so much natural and agricultural land use in the watershed, one of the big pressures that we're facing is land use change, because there is that natural and agricultural land, so there is still a lot of potential for development in our watershed. Another thing reoccurring, we've heard multiple times today, climate change. That's another thing that's a threat to water management in our watershed. And also the state of stormwater infrastructure. In some case, it's not even existent in some developed areas. And where it does exist, there's capacity issues and it's aging. So these are some of the big pressures facing the watershed, but to focus more on the stormwater side of things. So to hone on that stormwater management topic, this slide's now showing the state of stormwater management across the watershed. So the light blue areas have no flood control and the green areas do have flood control. When you think back to that previous map I showed on that last slide, a lot of those urban areas like Halton Hills, Orangeville, Brampton, Mississauga, a lot of those are the areas we see in this map that have flood control. But the one thing I want to point out is in that South Mississauga part of the watershed, there's a lot of it without flood control. So this is the area that was developed in the 60s, 70s, 80s, before storm ponds. So there's a lot of legacy developments in the most densely populated part of our watershed that has no flood control. So we see evidence of some of these problems throughout our watershed. The image on the left, this is the mouth of the Credit River where it enters Lake Ontario after a rain event. So you can see that sediment plume entering Lake Ontario. And I'll give one statistic to go with this image. The Credit River is the 4th largest contributor to phosphorus on the north shore of Lake Ontario. So not a statistic that as a conservation authority we're proud of, but that's the reality. We have water quality issues in our watershed. And that's not from, a couple industries putting their effluent into the Credit River or a couple wastewater treatment plants. That's from thousands of parking lots, thousands of driveways, thousands of kilometers of paved roads. On the water quantity side of things, we've heard a little bit about that July 8th, 2013 rain event. The images on the right are from that storm. And it's not necessarily just flooding. We see water quantity issues on both sides of the spectrum, both flooding, drought. It's not uncommon for have intense flood events in South Mississauga while our farmers up in Orangeville are experiencing drought conditions. But a lot of the cause of this has been due to the legacy of how we've been managing our stormwater or conventional stormwater management. So conventionally, municipal infrastructure for stormwater management gets put on private property. So either within the road or on public property, sorry. So either within the road right of way for conveyance or end of the pipe stormwater treatment facilities like stormwater ponds. Well, they each have advantages and disadvantages. Managing stormwater in the road right of way is logistically very difficult because you're competing for such a small amount of space. If you pull up the asphalt and the concrete within the road right of way, it'll look like spaghetti. You have your water mains, your sanitary sewer, gas lines, telephone cables, hydro, Rogers, like you name it, it's in the road right of way. So competing for space and doing really any meaningful stormwater management in the road right of way is a challenge. Stormwater ponds, on the other hand, we know they're great for flood control, but they take up a lot of space and urban land is expensive. And they also have large price tag for construction and rigorous maintenance requirements. So you have these right-of-way stormwater management and end-of-the-pipe stormwater management features all on public property, but the percent of the urban land fabric that is public property is only about 20% or less. So municipalities are doing all of their stormwater management on about 20% of the land fabric. So we have evidence of what the problem is. So the reason we're here today and the solution, it's low impact development. So it's those source controls that infiltrate and filter water wherever it falls. So get it into the ground, filter it, clean it where you can, where it falls. Now, as a CA and as a partner in that Sustainable Technologies Evaluation Program, we've been monitoring LIDs for about 10 years now and developing the guidance documents. We have a planning and design guide, construction guide, monitoring guide, and that's just our organization. There's many other agencies doing similar work, but we know they work. We've seen the performance of them, but why aren't we seeing that wider scale uptake? Well, a big reason, it comes down to that costing piece. So it's one thing to include low impact developments in the design of new greenfield developments, but what do you do when your urban land fabric looks like this? There's no green space. You're limited to a retrofit scenario. You can't put a pond in there, so almost every landowner is left to themselves to navigate this stormwater management process for their property. So you're limited to a retrofit scenario. And even some municipalities, they were residents and business owners, they pay annual stormwater utility fee, and some municipalities will offer a rebate if you implement stormwater management controls on your property. City of Mississauga is one of those municipalities that'll offer a rebate, but even with the incentive, the payback period for the landowners is still far too long to really drive a business case to facilitate that wider scale uptake of low impact developments. And then building on top of that cost barrier, there's not really a clear implementation framework for landowners to navigate getting stormwater management on their properties. You know, every landowner would be responsible for hiring an engineer, reviewing those drawings, deciding what they want to see and don't want to see on their property, navigating the permitting process. So this puts a lot of administrative burden on each individual property when you're looking at lot by lot retrofits. But if we truly want to have these source controls and low impact developments as a part of the urban land fabric for stormwater management, we need to find a way to get these source controls onto private property and to unlock that 80% of the urban land fabric to do stormwater management where we traditionally haven't been doing it. So in terms of cost, what about instead of looking at retrofitting on a lot by lot basis, we start thinking about aggregating multiple properties together for one communal stormwater management retrofit? So in this scenario, instead of each property being responsible for hiring an engineer, doing a geotechnical survey, doing a topographic survey, all of these landowners can come together in a communal manner so they can share in the cost of one engineer, one geotechnical survey, one set of permits. So right off the bat, by having multiple properties come together for a communal stormwater management system, you can start to see some cost efficiencies and even logistical efficiencies right off the bat. This is just one possible example of what a communal stormwater management system could look like. So this is a shared private-public solution. So you have runoff from the road right-of-way being directed to a series of bioretention planters at the fronts of these properties. In this scenario, you have rooftop runoff from 3 of the roofs being collected and conveyed to a subsurface storage tank. So a situation like this could potentially be a win-win situation for the municipality and for the landowners, because the municipality, they're now meeting their stormwater management targets, and these landowners, they're getting a stormwater credit. So a situation like this could be a win-win scenario. But how do we get a communal system like this in the urban land fabric today? So that's where this Drainage Act piece comes in. The Drainage Act, it's a piece of provincial legislation, so it's unique to the province of Ontario, and it's been around in some form or another for 180 years. So for a piece of legislation to stick around for that long, it has to be pretty good at what it was intended to do. And it's not your typical regulatory legislation that you might be more that you might know more about. It's more an enabling legislation. It's for anybody in Ontario to have improved drainage. So if you own land in Ontario, this is a tool that's open to you to use. So for like residents, businesses, municipalities, if you own land, you can use this tool. Now, traditionally, the Drainage Act has been used more in that rural context. As you can see, the governing body of the piece of legislation is the Ontario Ministry of Agricultural, Food and Rural Affairs, and it's been used more traditionally to provide a legal outlet for agricultural tile drainage systems. But nowhere in the Act does it specify that it can only be used in rural areas, and there are a lot of examples of when the Drainage Act has been used for urban stormwater management in municipalities. And ultimately, there's 3 fundamental elements of the Drainage Act, of systems that are constructed under the Drainage Act. 1, they're community projects. 2, they gain legal existence. And 3, it's municipal infrastructure. So yes, at this point, I'm suggesting putting municipal infrastructure on private property, but there are provisions within the Drainage Act that ensure that those features are protected, maintained, and there's a lot of provision, even for more than what I've just mentioned. It's a really flexible piece of legislation. So this is, to avoid reading a nearly 200 section piece of legislation, this is the Drainage Act process in a nutshell. So it gets kicked off when a landowner submits a petition to the local municipality for improved drainage. From there, the council of the local municipality, in most cases, will appoint an engineer to the project. The engineer, they're responsible for going on site, surveying the drainage issue, and then they're responsible for developing an engineer's report. So in that engineer's report, they include the design of the drainage system, a cost estimate of the drainage system. It's the engineer's responsibility to do a cost distribution to get that system in the ground. And then in that engineer's report, the engineer also includes provisions for future maintenance. So they'll lay out the cost of who pays what when this system gets maintained in the future. So whoever uses this drain and benefits by the drain, they're the ones that typically get assessed or a cost for, so it's like a cost sharing between, if the municipality in some cases may cost share, landowners can come. So it really is that communal project where multiple properties come together to share in the cost of one drainage solution. Once the engineer's report is completed, it gets read by council 3 times and adopted as a bylaw. So from there, the system gets constructed, and then it also gets inspected and maintained. It's in the role of a municipal employee called the drainage superintendent. They're the ones that are chiefly responsible for the inspection of maintenance of these features. So that's the Drainage Act process in a nutshell. But in reality, it's not necessarily this streamlined. It is a bit more iterative, and there's opportunities for appeals, because I've just summarized a nearly 20-section piece of legislation in one slide. So it's not necessarily this straightforward, but in a nutshell, this will do. And just to highlight some of the performance efficiencies and some of the cost optimization pieces that you can get out of using a tool like the Drainage Act. Well, for performance on that side of things, since you're no longer limited to the confines of your single property parcel, well, now you can start to do infiltration where the soils make sense. You can do work along and across property lines. So this has typically been more relatively underused space of the urban land fabric. You might see a grass swale between property lines, but communal projects gives more opportunity to have a bit more elaborate drainage system in that areas of the land. And aggregating multiple properties together, you can share synergies between your neighbors. So something like aggregation. Well, I might have a large warehouse on my property that's really good at harvesting rainwater and that can collect a lot of rainwater, but I'm not a high-end water user, so I don't have much use for it. But my neighboring property is a shipping yard for trucks, and they wash vehicles on site. So under this communal stormwater management scenario, I could have my rooftop water harvested to go to my neighbor's property for their truck washing needs. So that's just a couple examples of some performance efficiencies that you can find by aggregating your properties together communally. Looking at the cost side of things, I already mentioned that whenever you do a communal project, you have multiple properties coming together to share in the cost. So through that, you can get some economies of scale right off the bat. But this Drainage Act process, it's really administered on that municipal level. So because of that, all the costs are initially borne by the municipality, and municipalities are HST exempt. So by engaging in a Drainage Act system under that Drainage Act process, that's nearly a 13% cost shavings off of the cost of the project right off the bat. And also on the cost side of things, under the Drainage Act process, it's the engineer's responsibility to fairly distribute the costs of the project. And they can't just kind of go rogue and assess costs to whoever for whatever reason. Under the Drainage Act process, there's certain criteria set out that they have to assess costs under. So I've listed them all here. I'm not going to go into them in any length of detail, but it really is up to the engineer's discretion, and the whole fairness test is put into play in the cost distribution side of things. Implementation framework. The Drainage Act process is a step-by-step process that landowners, businesses, or residents, they can follow it, and they don't really have a lot of that administrative burden on their heads through the Drainage Act process. A lot of it is administered by the municipality. In terms of the engineer's report, that's the engineer's responsibility. So a lot of the administrative burden isn't on the private property owners when you use the Drainage Act process. And like I said, it's a 180-year-old piece of legislation to get drainage projects into the ground. So it has that well-defined step-by-step process. A couple other advantages of using the Drainage Act. Because the engineer's report gets adopted as bylaw, that gives these systems legal existence. So if anyone damages or obstructs drainage works constructed under the Drainage Act, they can be liable for that. And it's not always just your drainage features. You know, if a part of this drainage system, tree planting was included, and if those trees were included in that engineer's report, then those too would be protected. So that's kind of how the Drainage Act ensures that these features that get put on private property are in fact protected because they have legal existence. On the inspection and maintenance side of things, well, if we're putting these drainage systems on private property, how do we ensure that they get inspected and maintained when they need to be? Well, I mentioned earlier the municipal employee called the drainage superintendent. It's their core responsibility to do the inspection and maintenance of the features, but that doesn't mean a landowner can't inspect the section of the drain on their property, or if any landowner notices a deteriorating condition of the drainage system, then they can notify the municipality, and then the municipality has to act on that. So I find that the Drainage Act is really balances the interests of the landowners as well as the municipality. And I hope by kind of highlighting some of these cost and performance efficiencies and advantages of the Drainage Act, it starts to answer the question, why can't landowners just aggregate themselves? Because you're ensuring that these features are protected. You do a fair cost distribution. It's a step-by-step process. Maintenance is ensured. So there are a lot of reasons that make the Drainage Act a really attractive piece of legislation for urban stormwater management. So we've been exploring these communal stormwater management systems at our CA in a little bit more detail over the past couple years, and we've engaged in a feasibility study where we're looking at the technical and the financial feasibility of these communal stormwater management systems. So on the technical side, that's more the engineering side. Is this technically feasible? And then the financial side, what's the cost benefit of these aggregated stormwater management systems? Do we actually have a business case for approaching low impact development implementation, taking this aggregated communal approach? So those are some of the questions that we're looking to answer in this study. And we've selected an area in the southwest end of Mississauga to look at. We're working with about 13 property owners. We approached 14 property owners about the project, and 13 have engaged with us during the preliminary phases. So the acceptance from the landowners has been quite remarkable. And we chose this study area for a few reasons. We had already had previous relationships built with some of the landowners in this neighborhood. Another reason we chose this neighborhood is because all of these properties are eligible for the stormwater credit, a rebate on their stormwater utility fee. So if these landowners, if we implement something in the ground, they'll be eligible for a rebate on that charge that they've been paying. Another reason we chose this study area is because the city of Mississauga is doing a master drainage plan update for this neighborhood. So we're hoping that some of the findings that we find with respect to these aggregated communal LID systems can feed into that master drainage plan update as recommendations. And the final reason we chose this study area, they all have drainage issues. Aside from the stormwater network that conveys water to the nearby Sheridan Creek, all these landowners have expressed drainage issues to us. They don't have flood control. One property owner says, I can't have my back warehouse doors open during a rain event because my warehouse floods. Another landowner says, I have localized flooding every rain event, and that takes up however many parking spaces away from my clients and customers. So there are challenges and disruption to business with drainage issues for this landowner. So that's another key reason why we chose this study area. These are some of the key steps on more of the engineering side of our project. We kicked off last winter with some landowner consultation. So we met with all the landowners in the study area individually, and then we also met with them as a group. And the reason why we put so much focus on the landowner engagement piece is that they dictate our constraints right off the bat. Like if they don't want to see permeable pavement on the property, that's not even going to be something that we consider. So we want to make sure that we're working within their constraints right off the bat. Last summer, fall, we did a topographic survey of the study area. We're working on cleaning up of our base map. So now we're kind of getting started into some of the real engineering work and looking at some design scenarios. So we're going to build an existing conditions model to see how the current flows are for the study area. But we also want to do some aggregated communal low impact development design scenarios and eventually compare that to what it would take to have that same level of service and level of treatment if all that stormwater were to be managed on public property. So ultimately do that comparison of that communal system to what it would take to do this on public lands. And hopefully we can have that positive business case for these communal low impact development systems. Once we select our preferred aggregated design, that will be the design that forms our engineer's report. So I mentioned the Drainage Act process kicks off by petition. No petitions have been signed for our project yet, but other than that, we're trying to follow the mechanisms in the Drainage Act as closely as possible because we really do find it a really attractive piece of legislation for urban stormwater management. I mentioned that the other side of the project is the economic side. So briefly to touch over the economic side of things, well, I mentioned we have these scenarios. So we'll have our aggregated design scenario, compare that to what it would take to have that same level of service, but all being treated on public property. So by doing that, you'll be able to do a cost-benefit analysis by looking at the savings of these communal designs. And a couple presentations earlier in the morning talked about these co-benefits like wellness, social wellness, having that green space. They might not necessarily be direct stormwater benefits, but these LID systems have various co-benefits. So by stacking the benefits that each individual stakeholder is receiving, it starts to make a case for an enhanced or a more elaborate incentive program. Take our study area, for example. Well, all of that runoff eventually flows into Lake Ontario. So MECP, they're now a stakeholder and they're benefiting from a project like this. It's the Great Lakes, so Environment Canada, they're benefiting for the same reason. Downstream of our study site, we have a provincially significant wetland, so now MNRF is now benefiting. CVC, we're getting our swimmable, drinkable, fishable waters, so we benefit as well. So if you start stacking who all benefits, you can make the case for potentially a more enhanced incentive program. instead of just the local municipality, the city of Mississauga, coming at the table with incentives, you can stack those incentives and make it more favorable and of good business case for these landowners to engage in. So the economic side of the study, it's starting small scale with those 13 properties, but they eventually want to scale up to the greater Southdown district. So to continue their analysis to see if it makes sense on that wider scale beyond that 13 properties. We do have a web page on the Sustainable Technologies website, so sustainabletechnologies.ca. And similar to the treatment train tool, if the first thing you Google is communal stormwater management, this is probably going to be your first hit, top 5 in most cases. But on this web page, we've written a paper that really explores using that Drainage Act process for urban stormwater management in a lot more detail, and as well as a discussion paper that looks at incentivizing stormwater management. So both the engineering and economic side of the study are all housed on this study website. And that's pretty much everything I had to say about LID and the project that we're working on. But if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.